The year is 2006. Eggs are affordable. Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon still actually make good cartoons, and you don't have to check out alone just to get a console and a controller. Gaming at this time is in a pretty decent space. The PlayStation 2 and the GameCube are, the consoles that are just succeeding with, flying colors, right? Like nothing is really, wrong about gaming in this time. But gaming is about to get a whole lot better. While a year prior, Microsoft had released the 360, which was by all means doing pretty well as a console, Sony would then counteract by releasing the PlayStation 3. Which, just a little biased aside, was my favorite console that I had growing up. Because I did have a GameCube and I did have a PlayStation 2, but the PlayStation 3 was the first console that I actually grew up with, that I actually grew up playing, that I was able to see its full life cycle, unlike the PS2 and the GameCube, which from my memory of, I kind of caught them on, the tail end of their life cycle. But I kind of just want to talk about the PlayStation 3 because I was just looking at some of my old PlayStation 3 games and it got me a little nostalgic, so I just kind of want to go down memory lane, if you don't mind.
Now a word from our sponsors.
Hi, before using Dubby, I was a father of 12. But now, after Dubby, I'm a deadbeat dad.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Let's see what we got in here for the Dubby. Dubby! We got the motherfucking... We got the motherfucking... Oh, shit. So the first flavor of Dubby, we have peach and beet.
You what?
Second flavor of Dubby, we got the dragon milk. Next flavor we have laxative.
What?
Oh, laxy grenade. Next flavor we have this is a zero sugar powder pack. And last but certainly not least, we have Heinz Berry Splash. I'm Wasabi, and this has been your Dubby advertisement.
Now, funny enough, I remember when the PlayStation 3 very first came out, because PlayStation 3 essentially had 3 versions. The very first version of the PlayStation 3 I remember because you had to hold the power button to turn it on and to turn it off, if I remember correctly. So essentially, I've had all 3. Why, you ask? Because some bitch ass motherfuckers stole my first 2 and I ended up with the 3rd one. So yeah. All that aside, the PlayStation 3, honestly, I feel like was one of Sony's I feel like it's Sony's forgotten masterpiece in a way, because the PlayStation 3 was a great console and I don't really see it talked about enough as being a great console. People kind of let the PlayStation 4 kind of overshadow it in a way. And to be honest with you, the PlayStation 4 is a great console too. I just really think all around the PlayStation 3, had a good rollout, had a great, set of starter games, and just overall had a lot of generational games on there as well. Because going through the list of the PlayStation 3 games, you kind of forget how many great games was on the PlayStation 3. Great games aside, one of the main reasons that inspired me to make this video in the first place was the fact that the PlayStation 3 was the last Sony console that had free online. You heard me right, kids, free online. Because obviously the Wii had free online, but you weren't gonna play Black Ops 2 on the fucking Nintendo Wii. You just weren't gonna do that. But the main reason that I even got a PlayStation 3 in the first place over a 360 was the fact that I could just play any game online for free and I didn't have to ask my parents to pay however much it was a month for Xbox Live or Xbox Gold. I could just play whatever games I wanted to online for free, which is a very, very forgotten concept and is one of the biggest reasons that I feel like the PlayStation 3 was Sony's last just amazing console for that reason alone. Because imagine if we didn't have PlayStation Plus and online was just free. It'll never be like that again, because PlayStation Plus has been around since the PlayStation 4 came out, which was 2013. That's 12 years ago. We're never getting that back. And this being a time in gaming before all the DLCs, all the the day one patches, before any of that. So essentially you just were able to get a console, get a couple controllers, buy the games, and just play them instantly however you wanted to. You could play them online, you could play them solo. You didn't need 80 different patches, you didn't need 80 different DLCs. There wasn't games being broken on release. If they were broken, they were just broken. That's just how gaming was back in the day. And this is even back in the time where I'm gonna make sure to put them in the video. Even the ads for the PlayStation were just more creative and more funny than the ads that we get for game consoles now. Gaming console commercials now, I don't remember the last time that I saw a good one, genuinely. essentially. So it's kind of like this was the last of like an age where like gaming companies would really get creative on the rollouts for consoles, because the ads for the PlayStation 3 were either, you know, creative or just, you know, actually funny, or just stuff that you would remember that would like stick in your brain for a while. The ads you get now are just game trailers with the Sony ad at the end of it saying PlayStation. Like there was generally like more of a buzz about the consoles coming out than there is now, because now, especially with the PlayStation 5, we were like, I kind of give it like a little bit of slack because it came out at like a horrible time where like nobody was even allowed to really go any fucking where, so like getting a console was just, you know, impossible. So I don't necessarily blame them for that, but the rollout for the PS5 was definitely like the worst out of all the PlayStations that we've ever had. And obviously with the way gaming is now, it was just a more of a, not necessarily nostalgic time, but more of an exciting time because you knew exactly what you were going to get, and you didn't, and there was no like, oh, is this game going to actually work on release? Is there going to be a 80 gigabyte, you know, day one patch to fix the entire fucking game? No, there wasn't. There was just, you got the game, you were able to play the game. And there was the PlayStation Move for the PlayStation 3, but we don't talk about that.
Dear PlayStation, I got a tip that you were making the PS3 $299. Confirm or deny?
$2.99? Bernie, you can't believe everything you read on the internet. That's how World War I got started. While $2.99 for the sweetest gaming, Blu-ray playing, movie downloading system in the world would be fantastic. No comment.
But all that stuff says $299. Right behind you.
I'm sorry, you said something?
PS3, now $2.99.
This was also around the time where exclusives to, you know, PlayStation 3 and the Xbox were also still a really big deal at the time. You had the Uncharted series, you had the Ratchet & Clank series, The Last of Us was a PlayStation 3 exclusive when it first came out 12 years ago. Since it seems like Sony just keeps remaking that fucking game over and over and over again. And other games like Infamous were just, you know, some of the great exclusives that like, you know, made you really want to buy a PlayStation and, you know, not want to get an Xbox, because exclusives were the thing that like, you know, drove sales as far as like, you know, Sony and Microsoft were concerned. Like they wanted you to get the consoles for the exclusives. They wanted you to buy PlayStation 3 to be the, you know, some of the only people who can play, you know, Infamous and Uncharted and Gran Turismo and The Last of Us and stuff like that. Like this was, and that's kind of another forgotten thing of like exclusives don't really exist anymore. Like they faded out very quickly, you know, once the PS4 came out, because with the rise of PC gaming and with Steam being where everybody gets their games from, exclusives don't really matter when Steam has every single game that you can want in one, you know, place. But at the time, these exclusives really decided whether or not people actually wanted to get a PlayStation or Xbox. If you wanted to play Gears of War, you had to get an Xbox. If you wanted to play Uncharted, you had to get a PlayStation. And if you couldn't afford both, you really had to kind of, you know, think about which console you wanted to get and hope that the exclusives were good enough to where you would feel like your purchase was worth it. In my eyes, the Uncharted series was, you know, proof enough that getting a PlayStation was worth it for me at the time, because Uncharted is still one of my favorite game series that has ever come out. Because before then, I had played some adventure games, but I never really played like, you know, an action adventure type of game like Uncharted. And there really wasn't like too many like Uncharted in a way, to where like Uncharted was cinematic enough to be a movie, but it was a video game. Kind of similar to how Detroit Become Human is essentially a video game, but you add in all of the action sequences that you can control, you know, the characters in essentially. And also with Uncharted 2 being one of the best sequels that I've ever played in my entire life, it improved on everything that Uncharted 1 needed to be improved on the graphics, gameplay, gunplay. Like everything was just a million times better than what Uncharted 1 was. And even other little small things really kind of tossed up like whether or not you really wanted to buy a PlayStation or Xbox back in the day, because PlayStation 3 was the first console generation for Sony to introduce wireless controllers. And with, you know, wireless controllers being a thing, the only time that they needed to be plugged in was, you know, when they needed to be charged, and you didn't need to, you know, buy, you know, 100 pack of, you know, a double or AAA batteries to put in your Xbox. And these are just some things that like gaming companies used to really think about, because the console war was kind of a real thing in the corporate world while also being a thing that people did online, because consoles were kind of like the only thing that was, you know, promoted to play games. Like PC gaming wasn't really a thing. Like you had, you know, you had your computer games like, you know, World of Warcraft and, you know, League of Legends. But PC gaming as it is today was basically in its infancy back in 2006, 2007. Like it wasn't really a thing. Relying on, you know, having a PC to play games, you were very limited in your options of what you could play on what you could play on your PC. And obviously now, PC gaming has took, leaps and bounds from what it used to be. But back in the day, there was really just console gaming. Like PC gaming wasn't really a thing. Even like, portable games like, like a PSP and the Nintendo DS were, still in its infancy compared to what we have now with, the Steam Deck and, with the Steam Deck and the Nintendo Switch. And all that is stuff that has essentially been, forgotten. Like console exclusive things don't really matter anymore, especially since companies are more incentivized to work together, because the more consoles or platforms that your game is available on, the more money you'll make now as opposed to yesteryear when exclusive decided on whether or not you bought a console or whether or not you didn't buy a console, which has become a thing of the past. Let's focus more on the games here. The launch titles for the PlayStation 3 were also very, very good in my opinion. My favorite being the MotorStorm racing games. The first MotorStorm and Pacific Rift were some of my favorites games back in the day, because I used to be really, really into racing games back in the day. We had MotorStorm, Pacific Rift. Mod Nation Racers wasn't a launch title, but it was also a great racing game on the PlayStation 3. But the PlayStation 3 did have like a decent variety of launch titles that had its RPGs, it had its sports games, its racing games, it's FPS games. It had a decent amount of launch titles, but what I really feel like one of the things that PlayStation 3 excelled at was racing games, because I feel like PlayStation 3 was the last like PlayStation console that had a good variety of racing games and didn't just focus on like realistic simulations of racing like they do now with Forza and the other racing games that they do have. I don't really know, but the PlayStation 3 had a better variety and way more fun racing games. Like they had because one of the earliest launch titles for the PlayStation 3 was a racing game called MotorStorm, which is one of my favorite racing games of all time, because it was the first racing game that it wasn't the first racing game to emphasize on the crashes, but it was one of the racing games that made crashing like fun, and it kind of had like more of an open world environment to the racing. And by modern standards now it's really outdated, but like back in the day in like 2007, I think that's when it came out, 2006, 2007, it really kind of like was a different racing game. It was a arcadey kind of crash type of style racing game where if you crash, you would, rock like the desert, which is where it took place in. You would crash in slow motion. You could race, a motorcycle, a car, a dune buggy, or a fucking like 16 wheeler across like this big ass desert. It was actually like a very different, but like a cool, fun, arcadey style racing game. And these next two I feel like are really, really underrated. I never see people talk about these, which is Mod Nation Racer and Split Second. Split Second was essentially a racing game about you being on a TV show where you're essentially racing against other people, but like it's an action TV set where you can set off explosions to essentially like try to win the race instead of regular Mario Kart items. You essentially set off explosions in like power plants and like city streets and shit. Like you could collapse like a whole bridge just to take out people to win the race, and it was set like on this action TV show where you would like try to be at the top of the rankings to get to the next season. And Mod Nation Racers is honestly the best arcade racing game that was on the PlayStation 3, because like MotorStorm and like Split Second, it was a very like creative idea. It was a very like cartoon kind of racer where you can make your own like little miniature karts, but you also can make your own racetracks and like upload them, and people can race on them, and you can race on other people's racing tracks. And it was very, very creative. Even by modern standards, I feel like that's something that like you don't see often. Like we kind of just get the same, Forza, the same like simulation style racing games. We don't really get a arcadey style racing game outside of Mario Kart anymore. Like we don't really see that much anymore. While they did have Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing and Racing Transformed, those were essentially just Mario Kart clones. Like they weren't really like different. They weren't really creative enough they were just Mario Kart clones with like a little bit of a difference, but nothing too crazy to make it stand out from the crowd like Split Second and Mod Nation Racers. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about PlayStation 3 games, is that like they really felt like they were very, very creative, and nothing ever really felt like it was stagnant on the PlayStation 3. Because outside of the racing games, the Little Big Planet series was another series that I really feel like showed like Sony's like openness to really, really creative games that weren't necessarily like action or FPS shooter based, because gaming trends have always been a thing. Like whatever game sells the best, companies will kind of jump at the opportunity to make those types of games, but they're really, really prevalent now than they ever really have been beforehand. beforehand. So like, first person shooters, battle royales, hero shooters, like they all have kind of just, felt like, really played out over the years. But I can say that during the days of the PlayStation 3, I didn't really have that, fatigue necessarily. I didn't have the, oh, here comes another platformer, or here comes, another, MOBA or hero shooter. Like I didn't really have those feelings in the days of the PlayStation 3. And Little Big Planet was just another like really creative game that just worked. Because it didn't need, like 1,000-page lore attached to it. It's just you were a sack boy and you went through this kind of like Adventure Time kind of fever dream trip. Like you would go through like courses throughout like, the world of Little Big Planet and shit like that. And people also could make like courses that you can run through and everything like that. But it just doesn't really feel like we still get those types of games, but like gaming trends kind of really do decide like what games we're gonna get for the future more now than they ever really did beforehand. And that's kind of what I just really love about the PlayStation 3 overall, is that it was kind of the last of a generational console that just like really emphasized like creativity over gaming trends a lot of the times. Because like I said before, gaming trends existed back then, but they weren't necessarily like so enforced like they are now. Like, a company, like unless a company is like specifically known for something, that we're gonna get like, a hero shooter or a PvP or like some type of PvP game or something like that from basically every game studio, unless they like, specify, unless they specialize in something, right? Like we know that From Software is gonna give us a Souls game like, every couple of years or something like that. But that was the great thing about the PlayStation 3, is that like you never really could guess necessarily about what like type of game we were gonna get, or just flat out know what type of game we were gonna get. They kind of just left that open to surprise, and I really appreciate that about the PlayStation 3. And I hope that one day we can get back to a point in time like that for consoles again, where like, when they come out, like there's actually like, a big buzz about the console coming out. Like, there's, clever and creative commercials for it. Like, there's funny, commercials and advertisements for it, and not just the standard, just, oh, here's the PlayStation here's the new game that's coming out for the PlayStation 5 or the PlayStation 6, and then that's it. Like, no, like nothing, really creative or really funny. I really do hope that one day we get back to that, so we can, have just a little bit more buzz about consoles coming out, so that it could, at the bare minimum, feel a little bit more special.
You lit